We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow. And let there be no misunderstanding. We are going to begin to act, beginning today.
We cannot shirk our responsibility as the leader of the free world because we're the only one that can do it. And therefore, the burden of maintaining the peace falls on us. And to maintain that peace requires strength.
Russia says hundreds of thousands of troops are getting ready to conduct the country's largest military exercise since the Cold War.
The United States does not start fights. We will never be an aggressor. We maintain our strength in order to deter and defend against aggression, to preserve freedom and peace.
It's the first time that China has so clearly stated its military plans and ambitions in the last 2 years.
We're looking for cooperation where we can with China. We will confront them where we must.
It is going to grow in power militarily, politically, economically, and it is going to be a force to be reckoned with.
And by 2020, China's rulers aim to implement an Orwellian system premised on controlling virtually every facet of human life.
For the third time in a week, mass protests shut down central roads in Hong Kong over a proposal to allow extraditions to mainland China. Activists fear the law would lead to an erosion of civil rights in Hong Kong, which has its own legal system.
U.S. officials say they do believe that Iran has forcibly taken yet another oil tanker against its will.
And experts are alarmed tonight over the ramping up of Kim's submarine-launched missile capability in recent weeks and the North Koreans' attempts to hide those efforts.
But longer term, if you're looking at the things that threaten American livelihoods, that put America truly at risk of its continued economic growth, China presents the far greater threat.
For Ronald Reagan, the belief that the future would indeed belong to free markets and free peoples was at the core of his understanding of what a peaceful and prosperous world would be.
Coherent message has got to build around the notion that freedom is better than autocracy.
We in America have never left everything to our government. We've always pulled together in the small towns, the large cities, to look out for those who are on the margins, for those who've been unsettled. It's a reminder that when tough times come, Americans pull together. We don't pull apart.
We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness. And these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. And we have good reason to be hopeful and optimistic.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Presidential Library and to our 7th annual Reagan National Defense Forum. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Cadet Senior Master Sergeant Sasha Patibanla from Royal High School to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and Chaplain Captain Richard F. Blanchette to provide today's invocation.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good morning. Please join me for a moment of silent prayer for the victims and families of the shootings at Naval Air Station Pensacola and Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. Almighty God, as we gather here in comfort and plenty, our thoughts are also with our brothers and sisters in arms as they stand watch in various places. For we know that our gathering would not be possible if it were not for their vigilance, Bless them and their families. And as we begin this forum, we give thanks for this opportunity, for these patriots to assemble for a common purpose and focus, to ensure our national and allied defense for the cause of peace. For all here are motivated by our love of country, each one here empowered with God-given freedom. And we know perhaps better than most that freedom has her enemies. Indeed, we live in a tumultuous world, and the challenges we and our allies face are numerous, so our nation must remain strong. For as President Reagan rightly noted, American strength is a sheltering arm for freedom in a dangerous world. Help us then, O Lord. Bless our president, our leaders, and all here to be prudent, to discern those voices of wisdom past and present, and keep us focused on the principles and virtues on which our nation was founded and has kept her strong. May we continue to take shelter under your outstretched arm and give us strength today. And now, by your mercy, bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies and the fellowship for the edification of our souls. Amen.
Thank you, Cadet Padabandla and Chaplain Blanchette. Please be seated. We are proud to host here at the Reagan Presidential Library America's premier gathering of defense and national security experts. At today's forum are men and women whose decisions set the course for world events. We count on your leadership to keep us safe, to defend America's interests wherever they might be, and to advance the values of freedom and democracy across the globe. And it is especially meaningful that we meet on this date, which for the past 78 years has reminded us that our freedom depends upon our strength. We're looking forward to the unique insights and perspectives of this year's distinguished speakers. Throughout the day, we will hear from panelists who are leaders in Congress, the Department of Defense, the military, and the private sector. We will also have special sessions with Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, the founder of Amazon and Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, and the service chiefs of our armed forces. In the evening, we will honor this year's Peace Through Strength Award recipients, Secretary Jim Mattis and Senator Sam Nunn. Peace through strength was the guiding principle of President Reagan's foreign policy. In the years since, we have been at our best as a nation when we have followed the Reagan example. The themes from this year's forum are deterring aggression and defending freedom. Neither of these is possible in the absence of American strength. We know a strong America is vital to a peaceful world. It's less clear what specific measures we should take to respond to new and emerging challenges. Today, we will grapple with some of the questions. How do we transform our military to meet tomorrow's challenges while addressing today's threats? In a century where war and conflict will be defined by new technologies, how do we harness American innovation to serve our national security? How do we strengthen our nuclear deterrent and to sustain arms control in a post-INF world? What will our relations with China look like in the aftermath of a protracted trade war? And how should we launch the 6th military branch in the final frontier? Each of these questions deserve thoughtful and deliberate answers, and that's what we strive to do with the Reagan Defense Forum, and what we hope we can achieve today. As we begin, I would like to thank our Reagan Foundation sponsors whose generosity and support has made today's program possible. Please join me in expressing our appreciation. Last month, the Reagan Institute released the results of our nationwide national security survey. By overwhelming margins, Americans believe, as President Reagan put it in his 1985 State of the Union address, that our country's mission is to, quote, nourish and defend freedom and democracy. The question for our first panel is how exactly our policymakers should carry out this popular mandate. With less than 9 weeks before the first presidential votes are cast in Iowa, will candidates make national security a priority on the campaign trail? Will the electorate demand specific proposals for countering geopolitical threats? And how might unexpected events between now and next November change all of our assumptions? Well, to lead our program and kick us off this morning, it is now my pleasure to introduce the co-chairman of the Reagan Defense Forum. And I can tell you he has been here since the very beginning. When this was just a notion, he stepped up and has contributed enormously to the success of this annual forum. He's co-chairman, and he's also ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry.
Thank you, Fred. On behalf of my honorary co-chairman, Adam Smith, and I want to welcome everyone to this 7th annual Reagan National Defense Forum. I suspect it's going to be a useful, insightful, maybe even a little bit inspirational day for us all. And as always, the credit and praise belongs to Fred Ryan and the Reagan Foundation trustees, John Hybush and the wonderful staff and volunteers here at the Reagan Library and the Reagan Institute, now in Washington, for putting all of this together. Several years ago at this event, Secretary Ash Carter just casually mentioned to me that he'd been talking with a young service member and had told him that there is no more noble calling, no better way that he could spend his days than to help defend the freedom of his fellow citizens and to protect him from adversity. To me, that kind of sums up what we're all doing here. Whatever your role, whatever your job, whatever your interests, we are all part of that noble calling to protect the country and expanding it to include key allies and partners to protect the values that freedom-loving people all over the world hold dear. When we gathered here last year, I was able to say that Congress had done something extraordinary. We had actually passed an authorization and an appropriation bill on time for a change. Well, unfortunately, we were not able to make it 2 in a row. But as you may have heard yesterday, we have reached agreement on this year's defense authorization bill, and that will be voted on in the House as soon as Wednesday and in the Senate shortly thereafter. Now, my request to you is, again, whatever your role, whatever levers of influence you have, use them and help the appropriators get the appropriation bill passed before December 21st. Let me offer one other thought to take us into our day. It's been growing increasingly clear over the years that we cannot look at national security through only a traditional lens. Planes and ships and armor are very important, but so are microchips and directed energy and information. We have to have vibrant, innovative suppliers in traditional industries, and we have to have a close working relationship with a lot of non-traditional companies as well. And that makes those relationships, those partnerships between government and industry more important than they have ever been before. And I think this event is the perfect place to think about and to discuss and to come up with ideas about how those partnerships and relationships can be even smoother, faster, and more productive than they've been before. You know, with the Chinese, the buzz phrase these days is civil-military fusion. Well, the bottom line is what they do by compulsion, we do voluntarily. And that means with the approval or at least acquiescence of the American people. As usual, President Reagan got to the essence of the matter when he said, "Free people must voluntarily, through open debate and democratic means, meet the challenge that totalitarians pose by compulsion. It's up to us in our time to choose and choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best." Free people voluntarily choosing to do the hard but necessary task. And that's exactly what leads us into our first panel today, what Americans think, public opinion on national defense, on defense and national security. To introduce our panel, please welcome our moderator, Jonathan Karl with ABC News.
To get right into this, we are, first of all, also being watched online around the world, and all of the viewers out there and all of you here will have an opportunity to ask some questions as well. They can be submitted on the RNDF app or via Twitter at #RNDF. So submit questions, and at the end, we'll do some of those. This is a very distinguished group. Senator Tammy Duckworth, of course, starting us off at the end, U.S. Senator from the great state of Illinois. Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming, also a member of the House leadership. Mr. Bill Brown, of the CEO of L3 Harris Technologies, and this guy here, Karl Rove, who, among other things,
stop there.
I suppose was Deputy Chief of Staff. Is that for George W. Bush? So to help us along with this fascinating and timely conversation about American public opinion and attitudes towards national defense and security, the Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute has commissioned for the second year in a row a survey of public opinion. It's a bipartisan survey done by Beacon Research and Shaw and Company, and has some absolutely fascinating findings, which we're gonna tick through some of this over the course of the conversation. But I thought we'd get started. If I could have each of you, you've looked at this survey, you've analyzed it. Give me very quickly what kind of jumped out at you. Starting with Senator Duckworth.
Well, I think that in order to maintain America's global leadership role, we have to support our military, but it also must involve U.S. economic engagement and support for the rule of law. And the polling shows that. So for example, in the polling, something like 60% of the respondents listed China as only a second to Russia as our major threat, as an enemy of the United States. But those same people also said, 75% of them said China's biggest threat is economic, not militarily. And I think that we need to talk more about supporting our defense capabilities, but also economic engagement, because the Chinese are certainly doing that. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, it's military presence, but it's also an economic aspect to it.
Congresswoman Cheney?
Thank you very much, John, and it's great to be here and great to be on this great distinguished panel. I was very heartened to see in the polling and in the slides things like a majority of the participants expressed support for NATO, majority expressed support for continued U.S. engagement, military deployment around the world, majority expressed support for standing with people of Hong Kong. And I think that this is crucial because those of us who know and believe in, and I would imagine every single person in this room, recognizes how important it is for the United States to continue to play a leading role in the world. The way that I think about it is America cannot be first if America doesn't lead and if we don't work with our allies. And we cannot continue to do that. We cannot continue to play the role that we've played since the end of World War II if the American people don't support it. It's just how our system works. And so I think that the slides and the polling was encouraging, but I think it really also points to the responsibility every one of us has in this room, as Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Thornberry, not for very long, but another as a Republican leader of the House Armed Services Committee said, but the responsibility that we all have in this room to make sure that we are doing our part to educate young people, to educate people all across this country about the extent to which America's freedom, security, prosperity, economic thriving depends upon us continuing to play the role that we played in the world with our allies in a very forward, deployed, and engaged way.
Bill.
So thank you very much, and it's great to be on this panel as well. I think right off the top, I think what was really encouraging to me is to see that 86% of those polled view the military in a very, very positive light. Trust and confidence remains very high, which is really important. And I think if I saw the data correctly, it's 22 points above the clergy, which is, I think, says a lot about the military. But to the senator and the congresswoman's points, I found the piece about China to be particularly interesting. 60% of those polled view China as a threat. The senator said it exactly right. It's mostly economic by a factor of 4 to 1, which I think is really interesting when you really think about that. So the message is getting through about China being a threat, but not militarily. So I don't think there's a lot of people reading the National Defense Strategy, because when you do and you look at what's happening in China and you see some of the threats, common Americans aren't aware of the threat in front of us in terms of hypersonics or electronic warfare, the offensive capabilities that China has developed in space, and the implications of how that could be exercised and the implications on everyday life for Americans. I don't think people really fully understand. I think it's incumbent on us as leaders in government and industry to find ways of educating the public more and more about the threats that are really posed upon us militarily, economically by this new adversary, and that is China. The last point I thought was really interesting is that 76% of those polled view the defense budget should increase, which I thought was very important. In fact, strong 1 in 2 were strongly supportive of higher defense budgets. I understand, like I think last year the NDS Commission came out and said 3 to 5% real growth over time is what was expected to deliver the National Defense Strategy. You know, that's aspirational, I would say, in the environment we happen to be in, but clearly a lot of strong support by Americans for a stronger defense budget.
I was struck the dichotomy between opinions about the military and concern about the budget. In this survey, 63% rated the military the highest, and everybody else, as you say, is below.
Quite a bit above members of Congress and...
Yes. Well, that's nothing new.
Yeah, but, I mean,
we love our member of Congress.
But
journalists.
Media, no, I understand, yeah.
Congress actually has a low...
15% for the media,
Right.
10% for Congress, but we dislike Congress as an institution, but we love our member.
Yeah.
But this doesn't necessarily...
Does that mean that we dislike the media as an institution, but we love our reporters?
No, sorry, it's the other way around.
All right.
As a group, you're better off. There's strength in numbers for you all. But I was intrigued by this, so I went back and looked at Gallup, which has been asking the question about, do you have confidence in institutions? And they've been asking these questions for decades. And the military has led in those decades generally. Hasn't always been number one, but what's interesting is a pattern. In the late 70s, 50% had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the military. Reagan comes in, and that number moves into the high 50s to the low 60s and runs that way through 41. There's one brief moment during Gulf War I where it rises to 85%, but it's in the high 50s, low 60s during Reagan in 41. It drops back into the 60s in the 90s, back to about 60, and then in 2002 it rises to 79% and has remained in the 70s and 80s ever since, with 1 year. The exception was 2007 when it was at 69%. Having said that, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between support for defense spending, which leads me to the point made by the two previous speakers. We need to articulate it, because if you look at, again, in this poll itself, the highest, do you think we need to spend more? What do we need to spend money on? Defense is number 3 after health and education. But if you say, what's the highest priority for the federal government, it drops to 4th behind immigration. And Gallup has looked at this as well. Spending too high, too little, or about right. And they also ask a question, should national defense be stronger than it needs? Is it stronger than it needs to be? Only one time in literally 50 years has a majority of the electorate said defense spending is, quote, too little. February of 1981. And never has a majority of the American electorate said our national defense is not strong enough. So these arguments on behalf of the defense posture and defense spending and the budget need to be made by policymakers and advocates continually, because while they think highly of the military, it's almost like they think they got enough to get the job done. Not a significant majority say they need more.
Okay, so I want to start with the point you raised, Congressman Cheney, about American views on engagement. So we can bring up slide number 1. 50% want to see America more engaged and assertive in taking the lead on these issues, about a third less so. But when you dig into the numbers a little bit, it's fascinating. You see broad support among a whole range of groups, those that are with a college education. About 60% support a more assertive and engaged America. Active duty households, 57% support a more assertive and engaged America. Democrats, 58% support a more assertive and engaged America. Republicans, less than half, 48%. So I know where you stand on this, but are you concerned that Republicans are becoming the America First Party? What's driving that? What's driving that?
I'm concerned that we are seeing groups, frankly, in both parties come together in a very dangerous way around isolationist principles. And I think that certainly we have those in the Republican Party who are adopting those views, and we also have those in the Democratic Party who are adopting those views. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think that, it comes back to the poll is important, and it's an important tool, but we also have to recognize that as leaders, we impact this. And so as leaders, we have to be in a position where we are being very clear about the critical importance of the role that America has played. And I think, frankly, what's happened is we have become, in some ways, a victim of our own success. I think you have, young people who've grown up after the Cold War who think that we, are always living in a world in which America is predominant, in which, we aren't facing significant threats of the kind that we faced during the Soviet Union's existence, but that's obviously not the case anymore. And I think we have to make sure that we are constantly reminding people about the extent to which that very freedom and security depends upon America being able to deploy our forces, depends upon our allies knowing they can count on our word. And that is something that's been an issue in parties and leaders of both parties, frankly.
But I want to drill down into this a little bit more and go to slide number 2, which is on the related issue of support for forward military base presence. And you see overwhelming support for that, and only 28% saying they want to reduce American military presence around the world. And where I want to go, and Carl, maybe you're the best to pick up on this, is the most high-profile Republican in America today is somebody who has mused about bringing American forces back from the Korean Peninsula, has talked about how America's been getting ripped off around the world all these years because we're bearing too much of the burden of collective defense, and has even had various views on NATO, whether it's obsolete or whether it's still a useful alliance. So is that prominent Republican who lives at the White House, who's made this case for an American foreign policy that is an America First foreign policy, changing the nature of the Republican Party? Is it now the party of Trump, not the party of Reagan?
Yeah,
or is it heading in that direction?
Look, we are in a tribal moment. And public opinion is not hard and fast and concrete, it's malleable. And we're in a tribal moment. If you look inside this data and look inside Gallup's data on similar questions, you'll see a couple of weird things happening that are running counter to type. The neo-isolationist sentiment inside the Republican Party is evident in this poll, but you also see it in Gallup. On the other hand, President Trump has succeeded in the impossible. He has made the Democratic Party far more open to free trade and far more suspicious of Russia. It's going the opposite way there. So I think you...
Is that a realignment of the parties?
No,
ultimately?
look, this is the tribal moment we're in. The question is going to be long-term, where are the two respective parties? My hope is that the Republican Party remains a party that is engaged in the world, strong national defense, suspicious of Russia, and my hope is these sentiments inside the Democratic Party that are pro-free trade and anti-Russia remain after the moment has passed. But this is a tribal moment. We're going through a lot of weird things where people are responding, not because it's in tune with their long-held personal beliefs, but because their tribe tells them to do so. And not a healthy thing, but I think it'll pass. And the question is going to be, over the long haul, where are the voices inside both of these parties going to be when they talk about the major issues facing the country?
Senator.
Well, I think that on Pearl Harbor Day, it is important that we're having this conversation about America's engagement on the global stage and a leader in the world. I do think that starting with the president's inauguration speech and everything he's done since, that he has made the Republican Party and then the America First Party. That said, I think we in this room have an opportunity here to push for our greater engagement on the global stage. If you look at what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region, you see that our friends and allies there are stepping up in the face of increasing of China's ascendancy, right? Singapore has done amazing work as our friends. Vietnam is right on the front lines and being very heroic in how they're opposing the Chinese. But we have to be there. We have to be there to support, freedom of navigation. We have to be there to support the rule of international law, which everybody agrees with, and that is a way that we can lead. And this also means economic engagement as well. And if we don't want to go back to where we were on Pearl Harbor Day with an isolationist policy and being dragged into leading the world, then we need to move forward together and push this forward. And some of my colleagues have spoken up about, how we must, and Liz, I appreciate the comments that you've made about how we've abandoned our Kurdish allies and how do our allies trust and engage with us into the future if we abandon a group of people who fought alongside and bled alongside American troops for decades, and then we leave them to be slaughtered. We have to oppose those tendencies, and there are a few voices on the Republican side, Liz being one of them, who spoke up, and I appreciate that, but we've got to do more. And this is a point in our nation, I think, where we choose, do we continue to lead? And this poll shows that the American people want us to lead, and they understand that there's an economic and international law aspect to it, as well as a defense aspect as well.
So Bill, if you take a look at the two decisions related to Syria, two major decisions by the current president and the previous president, the first, of course, not to act after the use of chemical weapons, declaring a red line, not acting on it, and then this decision to abandon our Kurdish allies, does this do lasting damage to America's image? This is more of a worldwide question than American public opinion, but it's still a public perception issue. Does it do lasting damage?
Look, I think it does do some damage, no doubt about it. But these things sort of ebb and flow, and people make decisions. It's not a static answer; it's a dynamic one. I think from my perspective in the defense industrial base and representing 2.5 million Americans who support aerospace and defense, what we're looking for is constancy of purpose, clear direction, clear funding behind that, partnerships with our allies around the world, and any individual event isolated that could detract from that is going to be, I think, problematic for us. So, look, that's sort of from a defense base. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Events are zigging and zagging. You mentioned Syria. President Obama's decision not to act on the red line. But remember, President Trump acted on the red line. And interestingly enough, it saw a bump in his popularity after he did so. You mentioned the decision to withdraw from Syria, which did us damage. You didn't mention the decision to withdraw from Iraq, which did us damage. So we've been in a position for 10 or 12 years where we've been zigging and zagging. And we've been zigging and zagging away from the position that the senator and the Congresswoman were talking about, where America was seen as a resolute, consistent, reliable ally. But it's not like we've gone from going this direction to going totally this direction. We're zigging and zagging. And there's going to come a point where the American people, you see it in this poll, they're willing to be convinced. They haven't, for example, in the question on the military buildup of China, the question is 71% are concerned about it, 24% are not concerned about it, and 23% are extremely concerned. Then they have an informed question. They say, well, what if you knew that a third of the international trade goes through the South China Sea, and we have the Chinese are building bases and declaring territory? Now suddenly it's an 82-13 question, and 37% are extremely concerned. So just simply making these arguments by national leaders and by advocates can have an effect on public opinion. And that's what's going to happen in the years ahead, a battle for where the country's going to go on these issues, because we've been sort of going like this, and the native instincts of the American people have been pro-defense, pro-engagement. The question is whether they're going to be sustained by their leaders.
Liz?
Yeah, I think, it's important for us not to sort of overlook, I think perhaps the most significant, most important thing that President Trump has done, and that is provide resources for the military on time in a sufficient fashion, which the United States Congress helped him do. And so I think, as we're talking about where we are in the world, where the policies are in the world, you can't have that conversation without remembering the extent to which, when the president came into office, what he inherited was a military that had been starved of resources to some extent. I will never forget one of my very first hearings as a member of the Armed Services Committee was when Secretary Mattis came to testify. And sitting there and listening to Secretary Mattis say, no foe in the field has done more damage to the United States military than the United States Congress has, particularly when you're a freshman member of the Armed Services Committee, that is something that you never forget. And I think that it's absolutely true that we have to make sure that we are leading in the world. We have to make sure that the isolationist elements in our parties do not become the predominant parties, but the predominant elements in the parties. But we have to also recognize that the United States cannot do any of this if we are asking our men and women in uniform to operate in a way where you don't have the resources you need to do that. And I think it's important not to have the overall discussion forgetting that critical piece of it.
I think you're giving President Trump too much, so much. Don't forget that the reason that the increased funding was able to happen was the end of sequestration, which was put into place after the 2010 rise of the Tea Party that put it into place. I was on the Armed Services Committee in the House for 4 years under Chairman Thornberry, who himself spoke up, and we had hearing, witness after witness, the military saying, we got to end sequestration. We can't do anything under sequestration. We can't make the investments. And thank God, bipartisanly, we allowed sequestration to end.
We ought to repeal the Budget Control Act. We should do that on a bipartisan
Well, there we go. Well,
basis.
we can, but President Trump didn't make that happen. That was just an ending of something that started in with the 2010, and so this is not,
You have to give him credit for requesting increased resources for the military,
and we gave
working
him
with us to be able to get it appropriated.
And we gave him an even higher appropriation and a higher authorization than he actually asked for. So once we got rid of sequestration,
What President Obama wanted.
Well, but President Obama also engaged in other parts of international policy that President Trump has now starved, such as the State Department. And we can't be engaged on a global stage, which is the military. Look, the military's job is to come in and blow shit up and kill our enemy. But the military's job is not nation building. The military's job isn't engaging on the ground every single day. And we need to have the State Department. We need to have foreign service officers. We have to have presence in the rest of the world. We've abandoned our American presence in the rest of the world, especially under this president. And frankly, we need to be there so that our allies know that we're going to be there, so that they see us there, so that even the Chinese will see America is constantly here. We're making the patrols in those sea lanes. We're in all of these places. We've not abandoned the field to our enemies, whether it is China or Russia. And that's what we're doing right now if we continue to gut and negate and neglect the State Department and economic engagement. I think we can come together in a bipartisan way and move this forward, but let's be clear about what's happening on a global stage.
So let me move to slide number 3, which drills down a little further into this support for American engagement. So first of all, on the question of eliminating potential threats before they strike, 86%, overwhelming. Preventing human rights violation, total support at 76%, again, overwhelming. Defending freedom in other countries, 76%. Now, I've traveled all around the world with President Trump, and I've watched as he's addressed some of these issues. it is not a foreign policy of engagement on these issues. It's America first explicitly, and we're not going to tell you what to do. You don't tell us what to do. I mean, he embraced the term America first, which is, I mean, all that it means in terms of the isolationism before Pearl Harbor. Yeah. So when you talk, Congresswoman Cheney, about how you have to stand up to the isolationist forces in your parties, and we could certainly talk about isolationist forces in the Democratic Party, but is the president one of those isolationist forces in your party?
Look, I've been very clear and very direct, both publicly and directly with the president. When there have been instances where I've disagreed with his policy, I've disagreed with his approach. I disagree with his decision in Syria, for example. I disagree with the negotiations that are going on right now with Taliban in Afghanistan. And I think what's important to remember, and I want to go back to something the senator said, it is true that the military's mission is, as you said, to blow shit up. But the military's mission is also to be there for the diplomats. And speaking as somebody who, spent a long time working in the State Department and spent a long time working at USAID on these economic issues, I mean, if you go back and you look at when the United States was in the best position in Iraq, and my view is we had won in Iraq before Barack Obama came in. Once the surge had happened, we had won, and we had won. Joe Biden even said we had won at that point when he was coming in as Barack Obama's vice president. And it was a decision to pull back, to retreat, to withdraw based on a political timetable that ended up creating the situation that President Trump inherited. Now, but when we were at our strongest moment in terms of our ability to be able to help the Iraqis begin to establish what we hoped they would be able to establish, was when our diplomats, when Ryan Crocker and General Petraeus, when they were able, and Ray Odierno, when they were able to work together, and America's military has to be there to undergird our diplomacy, and it has to be there so that people understand not just our ability to be able to respond if necessary, and obviously that's where the additional resources are so critical, but also our will to use that force. And I think those two things are really critical. And we can't say we're going to stop doing the military side just to be able to support the diplomacy. I think we've got to be able to do both.
No, I'm not saying stop the military side. And I've spent a little time in Iraq. And most recently this past spring. And what I'm hearing from the folks on the ground is America is the rebar of the concrete that's keeping Iraq up. And our military is that rebar. We have to be there. Yeah. But that said, our allies have to be there, and we have to engage in other ways as well. Iraq has no banking system. These young people that are on the streets, the problems that they're having with employment and there's no banking system there. People keep money in cash, and why are we not engaging, using our diplomatic side, using our economic might to engage and help them set up a banking system? Why are we not engaging in all of these other ways, supporting American companies to go in and help them build the refineries, to help them push the Iraqi government into signing more agreements with American companies? We need the rest of that engagement. That doesn't mean that we pull the military out, and that doesn't mean that we don't support the military there, but I'm arguing for a greater engagement diplomatically, economically, and also to be the people on the global stage to say we stand for the rule of law, for international law and order. Because let me tell you, the rest of the world sees that China and Russia do not stand for international law. And if we're going to get our allies back and we're going to make more friends around the world, we need to stand on those principles and say we are the country, these are our values, we're going to engage with you, we're going to do business with you. If you do business with Americans, you're going to be treated fairly, there's not going to be corruption, we're not going to use a debt trap on you. Yes, our military is going to be here and we're going to be your friends, and our military is going to show up and we're going to make sure that the sea lanes are open. But we need to engage in all of the other ways as well, which we're not doing right now.
Carl, that sounds a little bit like an argument I could have heard in the Bush White House, 43.
We had lots of arguments. Look, I want to go back to your slide for a minute, because I think you're right to point out that there's a wide agreement on these three things. Yes. Fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. Stand for human rights and human dignity. and defend freedom. But let's be honest, one of the problems that we face, and I'm with Liz on this question of what we should be standing for, is the emphasis that people place. If you look inside them, 61% of the sample say they're extremely interested in eliminating threats over there. 34% are extremely interested in defending human rights, and only 29% are interested in defending defending freedom.
Yeah, that's extremely. But if you look at, if you include,
I know, but the extremes tend to drive public opinion in all cases. It tends to be a center. It tends to be an indicator of where the strength of the argument is. So I have 2 points to make. One is, you can look at the president and say he's not standing up and saying, I want to defend freedom everywhere and I want to defend human rights. But the one thing that the American people instinctively feel about him is he wants to get those bastards. And that goes a long way in sort of saying he's standing up for America's interests. It also says that, again, going back to the old saw, if we believe in these things, if we believe, as Reagan did and as 41 did and as 43 did, that it is necessary for the United States to set an example of standing for human rights and freedom, then we better be making that argument. But we got to be careful about sort of saying, well, he's so isolationist that he's not doing any one of these three. In the view of the American people, he's doing number one pretty damn good. He's seen as a strong leader who's willing to take them on. And we saw that contrast most clearly in the instance of Syria. When he stood up at that news conference and said he'd crossed a lot of red lines with me, I said, here we go again. Like President Obama, we're going to look feckless. And what happened is, a matter of hours later, 25% of the Syrian Air Force is blasted in their cubby holes by U.S. cruise missiles. So the American people look at this guy and say, when he says America first, he means defending America from threats all around the world.
I think Liz might have wanted to see a more assertive strike on that at that point.
Well, and look, let's be honest. When you have the left of the Democratic Party, I mean, when I was appalled last week when the AOC and the Squad came out and tweeted in favor of Morales in Bolivia and saying that it was a coup, and the things that they have said about Venezuela and what is going on there is, this is not the Democratic Party of 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. They're the Scoop Jacksons. There are not enough Duckworths, and there are no Scoop Jacksons. And this is going to be a problem. This is why it's going to be a problem for anybody who cares about those three big, important things on that chart. In both parties, we need to have advocates for those causes, and there are not enough of them in either party, in my opinion, today.
Okay, we're going to get to questions shortly, but I want to tick through a couple of other just quickly, some interesting findings. One is on, let's go to slide number 4. This was something that Senator Duckworth referred to, the view of China as an enemy, which is interesting, and an interesting breakdown also in terms of where this is. And those least likely to have that view are younger voters, which I thought was interesting. But I want to switch to the next one, which is those that see Russia as an ally. And what you saw in this survey, now being the second year that the foundation has done it, more people see Russia as an ally than last year. So take a look. So overall, you still have only 28% seeing Russia as an ally. But last year it was 19%. So I was wondering what was driving that. And if you look in, I'm going to quote from the write-up on the survey by the folks that did it. The percentage identifying Russia as an ally has increased from 19% to 28%. This improvement is predominantly driven by Republicans who have responded to the cues from President Trump about Russia. You surprised by that?
Do I get to answer
I mean,
that one?
we're here at the Reagan Library. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I think there is a very concerning trend that we're seeing. And I think there are a lot of elements to it. But I think that we have to be absolutely clear, Republican, Democrat alike, it doesn't matter. I am pleased, and Carl talked about this now, to have so many in the Democratic Party who are Russia hawks. I think that's phenomenal, and I think we ought to make sure that continues. But we should not, as Americans, lose sight of the fact that the Russians are an adversary, that the Russians interfered in our election in 2016. They will attempt to do so again. So will the Chinese, likely. But there shouldn't be any question about where the Russians are on that side of the line. And I also want to say, if you really want to understand Russia and Vladimir Putin, Fiona Hill's book about Vladimir Putin is about the best source you can find.
Bill?
Yeah, look, Russia today, I think, is probably one of the more significant threats, but economically, they're not anything like China. You know, the reality, I think, that, you know, the nearest next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years, cyber, what they're doing, what they did in the Ukraine, their electronic warfare capability, their ability to project power, they're a very significant adversary today. Over time, I think the issue is going to be more China because of the growth in the economy, the significant investments they're making in research and development, advancements in artificial intelligence, you know, building new capabilities that will damage our position in our overhead architecture. I think over time it's China. Today, I think Russia is a very big threat.
Senator, how do you see Russia? I mean, aside from the election interference, the larger long-term.
Well, I think China is the ascendant power here, not Russia. That said, I am deeply concerned with the alliance that now developing between China and Russia coming together. And we need to be very wary of that and those efforts that are happening. I think the polling shows that the people who responded to this poll also accurately identified cyber as a major threat. Yes. And I think a combination of both China and Russia is a real problem for us in the long run. I also do think Russia did attempted to interfere in 2018 as well, not just 2016, but 2018 as well, and we were able to stop them thanks to our great efforts here in the U.S. And we need to support those parts of our government and defense and that are mounting that capability. But we have a lot more to go in terms of cyber, and that is really the area where I think we're going to have the greatest vulnerabilities leading into the future. While we're doing that, we got to maintain what we have. The NDS, I think, is very accurate in its predictions, but I also think NDS is lacking in certain things. I think there's a woeful shortage of attention paid to investments needed in our logistics capabilities. We just flex our ready reserve fleet, which is what we would use to help move our troops, power projection, talking about that power projection piece. And in order to get 55 ships, U.S. flag vessels to sea, we had to pull mariners from all of the other ships, and we barely got them out there. And of those ships, half of them are going to age out. They're over 40 years old. So we have some more work to do on NDS and where we're looking. So cyber, Russia, but then also let's not ignore the core of what the military needs in order to do its job, not just to put the F-35s out there, but to sustain those F-35s in the long run.
Okay, I want to go to slide number 6, changing subjects here. I thought this was fascinating, looking at the top problems facing the country. And the number one issue mentioned is politics and partisanship, followed by corruption and incompetence of leaders. Carl, what do you make of that? I mean, you mentioned the tribalism that we were saying. We're in a tribal moment. And it seems, I mean, this survey is correct. A good chunk of the country is also deeply concerned about that.
Yeah, I think they are. And the good news is that we've been here before. We sort of like to think, we gaze at our own navels and say, okay, the politics is disrupted, our system is dysfunctional, the two parties can't cooperate, they're at each other's throats, we're not getting anything done. We've been here before. The system is broken in our own.
Is it worse now?
You know what? No.
No?
I mean, think about where we were in the late 1960s and early 70s. Our cities were aflame, campuses are riots, kids are dying on campus, violent protests against the war, protests against civil rights, 2 presidents forced from office, 1 voluntarily, Lyndon Johnson, 1 involuntarily, Richard Nixon. It looked like we were coming apart. Think about the early 1930s, 1 out of every 4 Americans is out of a job. You think the politics is bad today? Go read about the Gilded Age. There's a brilliant book I would recommend to you. I think I did a hell of a job on it myself, called The Triumph of William McKinley. You think politics is bad today? We have 5...
I was waiting for a McKinley reference.
Yeah,
it took us 25 minutes to get to...
5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody gets 50% of the vote, 2 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, and 20 years of divided government where the two parties have deeply divergent views and hate each other's guts because they are still fighting the Civil War. When the Democrats take control of the House for the first time in 16 years, in 1874, it's called the Victory of the Brigadiers. because they have wiped out so much of the black Republican vote in the South that Confederate officers get elected to Congress. You go back and read the era there, and it makes today look like everybody is sitting around the fire roasting marshmallows and singing Kumbaya. The 1840s and 1850s, 1824 to 1828. When is the first armed assault on the floor of the House of Representatives? 1797.
Yeah. Oh, 1797.
1797. Griswold and Lyon go at it as the Federalists and the Democrats hate each other's guts.
Matthew Lyon of
Spitting Lyon of Vermont, who later
first guy to get elected from he get elected from his jail cell, right?
No, yes, he did.
Yeah,
and then he got tossed out of office and did what every northern politician did. He went south and got elected to Congress from Kentucky. But anyway, my point is, we've been in bad places before, and at some point, the good common sense of the American people, asserts itself, and the system gets better. So let's not kid ourselves. We're sitting here today wringing our hands about it. We had a government shutdown. Did you know that in 1889 and 1890 that the House of Representatives spent 5 months without being able to pass a single bill? Because the Democrats refused to answer the roll call and thereby denied the House a quorum. They have 5 months of voting in which they don't pass a single bill because they have a vote. As soon as the vote is done, a Democrat says, Mr. Speaker, I believe there's no quorum present. They call the roll call and no Democrat answers the vote. And it takes a Supreme Court decision and the autocratic action of Czar Reed, Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine to make the Congress functional. So let's not kid ourselves. We've been here before, and we'll get out of it somehow, some way, some form. But let's not think that we're at a place that we've never, ever been before.
Okay, all right. A little optimism based on how bad things have been before. So,
and don't get me started on the media, by God. Don't get me started on the media.
I won't. Okay, one more, just a quick one. The right track, wrong track number I thought was interesting. And this is slide number 7. There might be a mistake in the slide, though. But the question is, right track, wrong track. Yeah, there you go. So only 40% say right direction, 53% say wrong track. That is a bizarre number in an economy as strong as this one is, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think it speaks to the divisiveness that people see. And I think people are seeing that in their neighborhoods and even among, we just came off of Thanksgiving, right? So you see that around the Thanksgiving table. But I think people are seeing more and more divisiveness, and that people think is the wrong track. I mean, look, I left the most highly regarded institution, the military, to join the least regarded institution, Congress. By the way, Time Magazine did a poll where Congress actually had a lower approval rating than cockroaches and colonoscopies. So, I went from the military to Congress, so I'm not sure I make the right decisions. But I do think that America, as Carl has said, I can't believe I agree with Karl Rove. Nobody record this. But there is a lot of hand-wringing going on right now, and people realize we're in a time in our country where there is more divisiveness. And I think that's what this is reflective of. Not necessarily the economy, but just people don't like where we are because we are being split from our neighbors. We are, people are afraid to put bumper stickers on their cars because their cars get keyed. Yeah. And all of that.
Yeah, having said that, the economy was pretty good in 2016, and the right track, wrong track was 32 right track, 67% wrong track. So we're actually slightly better off than we were 4 years ago, but you're right. It is largely unconnected to the real state of the economy and how people feel in their own lives.
All right, so here I have the questions from all of you and from those who've sent it in watching online. So I have not seen any of these, so here we go. We'll dive right in. Will foreign policy and national security be defining issues in the 2020 presidential elections, or will they take a back seat? You want to jump on that one, Bill? What do you?
Look, I think it's going to be the economy. Frankly, I think that's going to be the top of the list. The economy. It's going to be healthcare. It's going to be. I think immigration and the border is going to come up. But national security is always a top priority in any election. But I think as we get into 2020, I think the economy is going to remain really important to people. We're executing really well. The U.S. economy is very strong. The jobs created in November was very high. Lowest unemployment, I don't know, since the late 60s. So it's just fantastic. But I still think it's going to dominate the discussion next year.
Okay, another one. How much does public opinion matter in foreign policy? Can we sustain long-term strategic competition with China when half of young people, as we saw in that one slide, view China as an ally?
Public opinion matters hugely, and I think we have to be able to sustain the competition with China, and I think it comes down to an issue of education. And I think that when young people understand and recognize, the fundamental difference between what it means to get to live in this world where America and our democratic allies around the world have been able to set the rules versus what it would mean to live in a world where China sets the rules. And that really is, pretty much the choice you have. China, Russia, those who will set the rules, who believe in authoritarian regimes, who believe in an authoritarian government. And I think making sure that our young people understand what it means. What does it mean when, you have a score based on your engagement and your involvement? You have a social score, and that determines, the government will tell you whether you can buy a train ticket, whether you can go to school, whether you can get an apartment. Fundamental everyday losses of freedom before you even get to what's happening with the Uyghurs, what's happening in Hong Kong. I think that young people want to be part of a movement that's bigger than themselves, and I think that the movement to fight for and defend freedom is one that is important that they're involved in, and one that I think young people are involved in. And I think that making sure we get the word out about what the Chinese really are, what they really are doing, what their intent really is crucially important to make sure that we can sustain and prevail in that competition.
I think this is a very macro look. Because in the same polling, the respondents also supported the protesters in Hong Kong and U.S. involvement in Hong Kong, and also protesters as even recognizing Taiwan as a nation, official recognition. So I would love to see this dug down a little bit deeper to see maybe the age breakdown, the demographic breakdown for support for Hong Kong and for Taiwan, because I suspect that that younger demographic fully supports what the young people are doing in Hong Kong right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't think that this particular poll gets to that.
I think the Congresswoman made the point a couple of times about education. I think it's a very important one. The fact that 1 in 2 people between the ages of 18 and 29 see China as an ally is concerning. I think people take for granted how GPS works. They take for granted that the systems that allow that to work just are going to continue to work. I don't think people are understanding the risk of how our lives will be affected if that is in fact impacted. There was a fantastic 60 minutes presentation by General Hyten and Secretary James a couple of years ago, talking about the risk to the overhead architecture. I think it was fantastic. I think we, as leaders, I think we need to do a better job of educating people in the country of the risks that we face.
On almost every question where there's a troubling answer in this poll, if you look at the demographics and the age breakdowns, 18 to 29s are the most likely to be on the wrong side of a question. They're on the wrong. They're taking the trouble. We want to be less engaged. We don't support military bases. China's our ally, and you have to remember the oldest.
Don't trust anybody under 30. Is that the?
Yeah, well, maybe, but they do need. I mean, we need to remember that the oldest in that group were born after the wall fell, and the youngest were born after 9/11, and they don't understand the world as most of us in this room have experienced it over the course of our lifetimes. I bet you a dime to a dollar if you ask that China question again next year, the number will be better, that is to say more suspicious of China, and it's because events tend to drive opinion, particularly when it comes to foreign affairs. Look inside this poll. Last year, the #1 place they wanted to put U.S. troops was the East Asia, because last year we were talking about the Rocket Man. This year it is the Middle East, because we're now talking about Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So public opinion and events will drive this. Education can help drive public opinion.
Okay, that leads me to my last question, which is, when you look at all these survey results, where do you see the most alignment between the opinions of Americans and the most divergence, the greatest divergence compared to the priorities outlined in the NDS? You guys want to?
I think the greatest alignment is the fact that we want to maintain our role. It goes back to the beginning, right, of this discussion, our role as leaders of the world. And that Americans want America to be the leader and maintain that leadership of the free world. They're just not sure how we get there. And I don't think there's an understanding of where the world is right now. And that's where the divergence is happening in terms of people don't understand China's military investments and what they're doing with their weapons capabilities, and that we need to counter those. And then there's a whole other discussion that we need to touch on engagement diplomatically and economically as well.
I thought there was one of the interesting slides I don't think we've shown was one that asked people's opinion of the United States military. Do you think it's the best in the world or among the best? And consistently in every single aspect, the slide, those polled said among the best.
Among the best, not the best.
Be the
Right,
best, yeah.
right. And I think, you know, that goes to the NDS. It goes to the extent to which we have to make sure people really do understand what it means if we aren't the best. Yeah. Really do understand what that means. You can't just sort of say it's fine for the United States to be among the best. Well, it's not fine because the others are China, particularly, and Russia. And so I think that I found to be a very interesting place where I think that they got it right, and I think it tells us what we have to do to make sure we get our funding aligned, our speed, you know, the reform that's got to go on at the department aligned with what we have to do to make sure we are the best.
I think what the senator and congresswoman has said is right. The one piece, and it's a key pillar of the NDS, is the strength and the importance of partnerships with allies. And part of America exerting influence around the world and having a presence around the world is having strong partnerships. And to me, I'm hearing it very clearly come through the survey, and that's a key pillar of the NDS as well.
Carl?
I'd say the thing that got me was the trust and confidence we have in the military. I mean, this is, you look at all of these institutions, and this is one of the two, the other being police and law enforcement, in which the confidence of the American people cuts across all lines.
Yeah.
And it has gotten, as I pointed out earlier, better since 2002. So maybe we better examine, why did it get better? What is the nature of that support? Why is it that they have such confidence? And what can we do to build on that in order to build support for the military, its budget, and its mission? But there's a confidence by all Americans. There's no significant difference in race, no significant difference in age, except the younger tend to be a little bit less trustful. There's no difference in income, geography, ideology. This is a unifier in our society, and in a moment when we need unity, this is one that can help us.
And Senator, bring it home for us. Why is that? Why is there such broad support, confidence in the military?
Because I think the military has, well, number one, it's above politics, and it is all about serving the nation, right, and safeguarding us. And I think even in a time when most Americans don't serve, they hold those who do up, I think, to an even higher standard than if we had a draft in effect. Because these are the people who willingly step forward to do this. And I think that's a precious thing. So I think we need to make sure we safeguard the military to keep it from being politically influenced, so that it maintains its role in our nation and maintaining those highest values that it stands for and maintains its place. Because once we lose that, we're in a real slippery slope, which is why, you know, I get really upset when I hear the president say things like "my generals" and things like that. It's not his generals. It's the people's military.
All right, that is all the time we have. Thank you for our panelists, Senator Duckworth, Liz Cheney, Bill Brown, Mr. Karl Rove. Thank you.
It was really good. Thank you.